Welcome friends to Rock and Roleplay. This is where we talk about all things roleplay. Although we do lean towards online roleplay in terms of MMOs, in particular World of Warcraft, and a little bit of Star Wars because that's what I play personally. But a lot of it applies to all different kinds of roleplay and all different kinds of settings. As always, if you have any questions, any comments, any suggestions, or anything that you'd like to say to us or ask us or have us cover, I say us, I mean I'm kind of like the royal us. I mean me. You can drop that in the comments down below or contact me on Discord or in-game or any other way that you find to contact me. There's a lot of social links down below as well, so you can find anything that suits you down there. I will do my best, answer them, cover them, add them to the list of topics that we have to cover here, etc, etc. So, and I'll let you know. If it gets added to the list, I will let you know so that you know it's coming up at some point, even if it might not be right now. As a disclaimer, I'm not a professional. I don't have a roleplay degree. I'm not a published roleplay author or anything of the sort. I just have an interest, I have opinions, and I would like to help people if I at all can. I've been doing this for more years than I can count now, over 10, maybe 15, maybe more than 15, a long time. So I have a bit of experience, but that's all I have. So what you hear here, things you might hear me talking about, opinions you might hear me expressing, might not agree with how you roleplay, and that's fine. That's totally okay. Roleplay is a very individual thing. That's the beauty of it. Everyone's creations, everyone's stories are different. What one person enjoys might not be for another person, and that's totally, perfectly valid and fine. So if you don't agree with the stuff that you're finding here, that's totally okay. It's just that might not be for you. There might be other things that we talk about that you do agree with. There might not. It's totally fine. Everyone, because roleplay is so creative and so individual, there's always going to be a disparity in what people agree on and things like that. So that's fine. If you don't agree with us, if you do things differently to how to how I'm talking about them, that's fine. You're not doing anything wrong. Just so that you know, I don't want anyone to come away from these videos thinking that I'm trying to tell you how to roleplay. That's not at all. That's not at all what I'm trying to do. I just want to talk about different topics that you might not have thought about, or that you might be concerned about, or that you might be questioning yourself, and you may or may not agree, and that's totally fine. You will be able to find the roleplay, the concepts, the stories and the characters that work for you and that you enjoy, and you can do that. I believe everyone can do that, can find the things that they enjoy without being rude or disrespectful to anyone else's stories and their enjoyment of things. That's the goal. But that's a topic for another day. Right now, today we're going to talk about factions and races. So let's get into it. Now, most games, you'll have factions, races, and classes. Or something, it might be called a different thing in your game, but it boils down to essentially the same thing. You'll have the two different sides, maybe more different sides, depending on the game. And within that side, you'll have a bunch of different races, and the people of those races generally will have like an occupation or a speciality or whatever that's essentially their class, like bard or mage or warrior, etc, etc. We're going to talk about classes a completely different day. Today we're going to talk about just factions and races. For example, in World of Warcraft, you have the Horde and the Alliance, a fairly standard one. In SWTOR, Star Wars The Old Republic, you have the Empire and the Republic. That's your two factions. So every game will generally have an idea of factions, different groups of people that are either opposed or perhaps allied, depending on the story and the narrative. A faction is like a team. It's a group of like-minded individuals. Perhaps it's purely individuals where different races can be on different factions, depending on their own personal beliefs. Or perhaps it's more collective, where for example, the Horde and the Alliance, the races tend to collectively join the Horde or the Alliance rather than be fractured among different things. Whereas in Star Wars The Old Republic, you can be of almost any race on either side depending on your character's narrative and background and story. So really depends on the game as to whether there's a limit there between factions and races, but you can... The game will tell you that. You can do your research on the game there. We're not going to go into every single one of them today because there's no possible way I could cover every single faction and every single race in every single game. Totally impossible. So we're just going to go over the idea of it, and we're going to break down a little bit of those in World of Warcraft, which are the ones that I am most familiar with. By all means, if you have something similar for other roleplay games, do drop it in the comments down below because that could be useful for people. So factions are like teams. they find themselves on opposite sides of the battle lines normally, because that's a lot of where story and concept is driven, with a conflict between the factions, or not even if it's not a conflict, some kind of like uneasy truce or some kind of agreement. There's something that sets them apart, and then it depends on the narrative as to whether they're working together or totally at odds with each other. And it can change as well over the course of the narrative. That peace can become war can become peace. You know, allies can become enemies, etc., etc., depending on your narrative arc. So it's not always completely set in stone. And it's generally a good idea not to completely set a lot of things in stone, because narratively, over the course of stories, most things do change or can change, or at least should have the option of change, because that's what keeps the conflict fresh. But that's again a complex thing for a different time. Factions have different attitudes usually. You'll find different cultures in them, different ethics perhaps. The reason that sets them apart will either be a cultural difference, an ethical difference, a moral difference, something like that they can't agree on. Because think about it, if they all agreed, they'd be on the same side, right? Sometimes they can hold similar beliefs that they maybe act on in different ways, or maybe they hold similar beliefs but they're opposed because of past events causing old grudges, or causing divides that they haven't yet mended. There's all sorts of narrative tools that can be used to create the division between factions, regardless of how divisive it is, if that makes sense. In tabletop games, faction choices don't normally hold as much weight as MMOs, because your characters, all your player characters are banded together regardless of their affiliation to certain factions. But there are factions that you can have characters affiliated with in most tabletop games as well. It just tends to be more of an external character trait than an integral part of character choice, which it tends to be in MMOs, just because of the way games and game mechanics work and limit things. It has to work that way in a lot of MMOs. Depending on the game you're playing, factions can take different forms. They could be kingdoms, they could be countries, they could be geographically decided, or perhaps they're an allegiance, an alliance of groups with similar goals or similar ideals. Perhaps they're a collection of groups driven together or apart because of a certain plot point or narrative, or a set of circumstances or a situation. There's tons of different things that can set up factions that can create that divide in any given game, but it can be an important choice, so it's important to be aware of those in terms of the game that you're playing. Just take a look at your factions, take a read about what each one is like, and how they got to be where they are, because it could be a choice that affects your character concept down the line. So it's worth bearing in mind when you're creating them. This is not going to be a deep lore dive into the factions on WoW, because I think that could probably take too long for one of these videos, and it would be an immense undertaking. Maybe we'll do a little like synopsis of the lore overviews down the line, like a little welcome to the Horde and welcome to the Alliance things, but for right now we're not going to dive too deep into what all the factions are. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what a faction is and what differences that might have for your character creation. So yeah, we're going to make much more summarized lore posts in the future. So if you want those, stay tuned for those, but that's not for today. Factions, however, like I said, are an important choice. So regardless of your RP game and setting, it won't hurt you to type it into Google and to do a little bit of reading about your various options. Google's your friend. Honestly, when it comes to roleplay, get real cozy with Google. I say this, I've been roleplaying for like over 15 years now. I was Googling Cinderbloom the other day because I was like, I can't remember. It came after I started roleplaying, and I had a little guide of herbs, and it didn't cover it because it came out after the fact, so I had to go back and amend it. So yeah, Google's your friend. Everything you could possibly want is on Google. Do a little bit of research on your factions before you make those choices. If you already have a character concept in mind or a race in mind, think about how those ideas fit into that race and fit into that faction, and how that could work around. Now, they don't have to work. Here's the trick, guys. If you have a character concept that doesn't maybe necessarily work on the Alliance, that doesn't mean you can't go for Alliance. Because sometimes that contrast and that conflict can be the creator of a good story. That can be a good narrative. It's just something that you have to be aware of when you're going into that. so that you know that that's the kind of narrative you're going into. That character is going to be a conflict or a contrast to the norms of that race or that faction. Yeah? Doesn't make it bad, doesn't make it something you shouldn't do, just makes it something you should be aware of. Bear in mind as well that any decently written MMOs are not going to have a lot of super clear-cut good guys and bad guys. There's going to be a lot of good and bad on each side, so you'll find a lot of good and bad on each side. And so again, if your character doesn't necessarily, like the Alliance are the good guys in World of Warcraft, but they do a lot of stuff that's pretty shady for good guys, you know? So it's not a case of a bad character not fitting in on that faction. Not at all, not even remotely. So it's not so much of a limit, it's just something, you know, that you should be aware of where those contrasts lie, so that you're making sure that when you go into it, you're not expecting, if you're creating a character that's in a, you know, has a particular moral inclination or lack of moral inclination, you're not jumping into, for example, say the Alliance, and expecting them to be super on board with his lack of moral aptitude. Whereas because they're generically more morally inclined, or at least perceived to be, there might be a lot more of them that disagree with you. And that can be really good story, but you have to make sure that's the kind of story that you want to go for. I hope I'm making sense. I feel like I'm rambling, but we'll go for it, it's fine. Once you have your faction sorted, so once you know where you're going, it's time to consider what races they can offer you. Like I said before, some games like Star Wars, you can be any race regardless of your faction. Some games like Warcraft are more limited, in which case, if you've chosen a certain faction, that will limit the races that you can be. Although there is still like quite a wide choice of different races these days after all of our allied race editions. So in World of Warcraft, depending on which faction you choose, you're going to be limited to a set number of races, barring the Pandaren. When you roll a Pandaren, you can choose to be either Horde or Alliance. So they're the only ones that can go in between. So the Horde races are the Orcs, the Trolls, the Undead, the Tauren, Goblins, Blood Elves, Pandaren, Vulpera, Zandalari, Nightborn, and Mag'har, and the High Mountain Tauren. Not going to go into those all in great detail, guys, but I have linked them down below to the official Blizzard website that gives you a little bit of an introduction to their concept, the kind of vibe that their race goes for, and as well let you know the different races and things that you can be, the different classes you can be as those races. So if you do want to read any more about any of those races, there will be links in the description box for you. On the Alliance side, however, there's the humans, the dwarves, the night elves, the gnomes, the Draenei, the worgen, the Pandaren again, the mechagnomes, the Kultirans, the Lightforged Draenei, the void elves, and the dark iron dwarves. So you have the same amount on either side. There's a whole, in our next episode we're going to talk about classes, and I go into which classes can be and can't be on certain races, and there's a bit of a disparity there, but for the most part there's the same amount of races on either faction, and a lot of those races have connections to other races and like history with them and bits and bobs, so it's very interesting read. We might go into them all in more depth in later episodes, but for right now I have again included all the links down below, so if you do want to do some reading ahead of them, because it'll take me a while to get to them, then they're all down there. So basically, these days there is a ton of choice when it comes to races. There's far more than the original lineup. I think the original lineup had something like 5 races per faction. Now you have a bunch of different options. And there's a long way to go. There's a lot more races I think they could add. And I think there would be a lot more very cool narratives they could do with a lot of those races and a lot of cool stuff. So I would actually be very interested to hear down below, what is your guys' favourite race that is not yet an allied race, but that you would like to see as an allied race? I'm kind of a fan of the Snake Boys myself, but there's a few that I would like to see added. But tell me what would you guys like added as the next allied race? What takes your fancy? But once you know what faction and what race you want to roleplay, you're well on your way to getting things properly kicked off. So when we get back next time, we're going to talk about classes. We're going to talk about the meaning what each class is, and the meaning of class fantasy. I don't know if you've heard that word thrown around, but we're going to talk about it. The reaches and limits of different classes, and how important class is or isn't on your roleplay endeavors. Because some people think class is irrelevant to roleplay, some people think class is integral to roleplay. So we're going to talk about those different kinds of opinions in next week's session. It'll be fortnight, because these are fortnightly. But next time, we're going to talk about classes, guys. So until then, you guys have got your races, you got your factions sorted out. And next time we'll talk about classes. As always, if you have any suggestions, requests for topics, please drop us a comment. Jump into our Discord, catch me on Twitter, anywhere you feel comfortable, and let me know, and I'll do my best to make it happen. Remember, if you're hankering for some roleplay content before the next episode, you can check out RP Talks on Thursdays. We're coming back live. Our first stream of the year is going to be on the 21st of January, so we will be back live on Twitch on Thursdays at 8 PM UK time, myself and Fuse for that. You will find the links to that down below, and if you follow those links and you want to catch up on all the stuff we did last year, he has a YouTube channel where you can find all that for all those conversations. Again, I would like to extend my deepest, warmest thanks to my supporters on Twitch and on Patreon. They make this content possible, and if you want to catch up with us before next week, you can find all the social links in the description for our Twitter, our Discord, and our streams. And until then, guys, have a wonderful, wonderful new year, and I will see you soon. Bye.